Hello, I'm Ian McDermott, founder of International Teaching Seminars, and for more years than I care to remember, I've been working with people in organizations, internationally, in companies, in voluntary organizations, you name it. Where there are people who come together, I've found that being able to offer coaching skills to people who don't actually want to be coaches, but who do want to draw the best out of people, is something that they find extraordinarily valuable, because they are skills, so there's something to learn here. And if you want to be able to draw the best out of people, then that will be the answer to the question, why learn coaching skills? Because, well, suppose you wanted to pull out talent, have people be more than they have currently been to date, have them realize that they got more to offer than perhaps even they knew. Suppose you wanted to be able to empower people to be more proactive, be accountable. Suppose any of those things mattered in the world of work to you, then I can guarantee you that having some basic coaching skills will make it much easier to achieve those goals. And there's a reason for this. That there are a set of skills that constitute what I would call the coach approach. Now, the coach approach is something that has evolved very naturally over quite a long period of time now. I could say the last 40 years or so. But being able to do it without being a coach is something that many people have not understood as even possible. So let's clarify. What is the coach approach, and how would you do that? Well, if I tell you what happens when I'm just coaching somebody, and it could be on the phone, it could be in person. I do a lot of work internationally, which means people are on the move, and it often is on the phone. But what I know is consistently the case wherever they are, and whatever their particular role description is that there's a period of time, it could be as little as 15 minutes, it's often about half an hour, sometimes it's an hour. But it's very much, whatever the amount of time, there's something going on that's always the same. People call me, let's say, and there's a momentary pause. Whatever the drama of the day may be, that's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to actually step back, take stock, catch our breath, and then people can begin to clarify what's most important at this time, and how would they like to focus if they weren't being distracted by, 1,000 emails and so forth. So in other words, what's happening here is enabling people to take stock, refocus, catch their breath, then determine what would be best use of their time in the remainder of this day, this week, this month, and what's the top of their priority list. Now, that's part of the coach approach. It's just a natural way of punctuating a day to say, enough with the melodrama, what's really important. And that ability to take stock is something which comes not by me telling them what's important. How could I possibly know? It's not due to my extraordinary expertise, because frequently they're the expert in their subject, in their particular field, in their particular profession. But I do have expertise when it comes to being able to listen, to ask good questions that help them clarify their own thinking. Now, just imagine that you could do that. Would that be helpful? And is it just something at work? Actually, no, it's not just at work. It's got a huge number of applications. So, where might this be useful? Well, if I was to ask you, who's the coach approach for? It's for leaders, it's for managers, it's for people who are mentors, it's for advisors, I could rattle these off, it's for negotiators. But I tell you, it's not just the obvious kind of places where you have a clear role and you have a kind of authority. It's also in places where authority matters hugely to the development of, let's say, the next generation. What would the coach approach to parenting be, for example? Do you know how to draw out the best out of a child, out of your child? Do you know how to help them begin to clarify their own understanding so that they begin to take stock? They can think about things for themselves. They become able to question themselves even and their own responses. would that be useful? Well, if you're planning on helping a child grow into an adult, it won't just be useful, it'll be essential. And if I take an extreme example of this, I grant you, but it is one that I have never forgotten. A colleague of mine who, when she was a child, when she was really quite young, had spent a lot of time in hospital, and it was serious, to the point where at one stage there was not much that the doctors felt they would be able to do. And she had a very interesting experience, namely that her father went on a walk with her, still in the hospital grounds, and the news they had had was pretty devastating. 6 weeks to live, maybe, you never quite know. But what he did was something very special. He said, "This is what the doctors think. What do you think?" And she said, "I think they're wrong." And of course, she was right, and I know she was right, because I'm delighted to say, still alive and well. Now, there's an example of actually asking a child, "What do you think?" And there have been many times when I've been inspired by that to do the same thing. I have grandchildren, they're very young, but I talk to them in a way that I don't see too many other people do. And I'll ask them questions, and they come up with some really very insightful answers, and it helps me understand what they're talking about, what matters to them. So, that would be one kind of ability to draw, almost like drawing out the wisdom within and then helping someone use it. That's a way of working, but it's a way of being as well. So who's the coach approach for? Well, I'd say it's probably for human beings. But again, if I think about, let me go to the other extreme. If I'm working with a CEO, it happened many, many times, they are in a role where there's a great deal on their mind, they have a lot to do, and frequently, by the way, they're often in a very lonely role as leaders. I'm sometimes in the position of being someone who's just a strategic thinking partner. But again, it's about, whoa, let's take a moment. What's really important? What do you want? And what are the next steps that would make sense? Now, there are particular tools that have been developed in coaching, and they are specifically found in coach training, and they're incredibly useful. But who's all of this for? Well, I think it's for people who want to work in a way that is beyond command and control. Because if you're just busy telling everybody what to do, okay, good luck with that. I don't think it's going to fly for long in the world we now live in. I don't think it should fly for long, frankly, much of the time, because really good leaders listen. And knowing how to listen is a skill in itself. Again, coach approach, fundamental skill. So what would that mean let's say if you were mentoring somebody? It's a professional commitment you have. Now, there are different ways of mentoring. Well, let me tell you, my son, I think what you should do. No, that's advice giving. It's not really mentoring. I had a very interesting assignment some years ago, working with a voluntary organization that was concerned to empower the next generation of young women. And we're talking about 145 countries that this was going to be rolled out in. And what happened was the women who were going to be these young women's mentors, they had a particular way of mentoring, which was very action-orientated. Do this, do that. And the fundamental difference was that they learned to begin to ask questions of these young women. What did they imagine? What contribution could they see themselves making? What were they drawn to be doing? So it becomes much more of a conversation. And in the process, they began to realize how basically they needed to do less, talk less, listen more. And strangely enough, the young women started to have views of their own because they were in conversation and began to, as it were, hear themselves think. So there's something fundamental here about the art of a coach approach, whether you do it in the bar, whether you do it over a meal, whether you do it in a corridor for 2 minutes, it's going to involve something called conversation. And conversation is incredibly powerful. We know this in ways that we didn't until fairly recently, because we now have some understanding of what's going on in the brain when you engage in conversation. It is a particular way of processing whereby you clarify your thinking. And so often we need to talk something through, don't we? I mean, expressions in the language for good reason. Now, what I see a lot with professionals is they don't quite know how to have conversations, to be perfectly honest. Some of them, and indeed I might say many of them, really like presentations. You know, the presentation, the slide deck. There's a strange sort of security about the presentation. They rolls on, they can. I've sometimes seen people almost hide behind the presentation. But of course, what happens in a conversation is you don't know what the other person's going to say. You actually have to listen so you know what they've said. And there will be these pauses. And often those pauses are part of when people are processing, they're thinking. So you don't need to be talking every single moment. And conversation changes how people engage with each other. If you're listening, you're more attentive. If you're more attentive, the other person picks that up unconsciously, without question. We've got very good research that shows people pick up the cues. So it's different from, if this person would just stop talking, I can get my next point in. So there's a way of being here almost, where it doesn't have to take a lot of time. As I say, it could be 5 minutes in a corridor. But you ask a question, you engage in a brief kind of conversation, and the other person begins to clarify their thinking. You share a view on what might come out of that, and it's like you've had a mini meeting. But the way you did it was totally different. You weren't offering advice. Why bother? Do you know how ineffectual advice giving is? Of course you do. Think about people who have offered you advice. How much of it have you ever taken? An astonishingly small percentage. So here's something about being able to listen really matters. Now, that's a skill. And it really is something that people often need to practice so that they are comfortable in being able to not speak for a few moments while letting someone else speak, and to know that you'll be fine. You will have a way of responding, but something else goes on in good conversations. Something else happens, which is, it's like a dance between the two people, or between a team. All of this applies to teams just as much as it does to person, one-to-one. And in a sense, one of the things that I've seen over and over with a coach approach is there's great clarity when you start with saying, so, what do we want to do here? What are we trying to achieve? What do you want? How will you know if you get it? How long is our meeting going to be? Are we going to do this more than once? And so forth. You're basically designing an alliance together. Now, I've seen this so many times now that I almost take it for granted, but I shouldn't, because learning how to build an alliance, that is to say, to be explicit about how we're going to do things together, to what end, how we know when we've done it, all of that is just basic to a coach approach. I mean, any coach learns that very early on in their training. If they're really doing, I'm going to be a coach here, explicit and brief in setting, if you will, terms of engagement. As soon as you can do that, everybody knows where they are. And it is an alliance. You are allies. You meet on the same level. It's not that one of you's got all the answers. No, there's a kind of democratization. And that's really important, because people feel different. They don't feel defensive. They don't feel like they're on being inspected or examined. And so they can be more real themselves. So that's part of the why conversation matters. But then, benefits. Well, what are the benefits of doing any of this? Why bother? Well, I'll tell you, the benefits come in two forms, I think. There's who benefits and how benefit. How do we benefit? How does it show up in our ordinary lives? Now, the who benefits an individual. Yes, because you begin to be able to think more clearly, have time with yourself, clarify your own thinking, but to do it with another person in conversation who's not butting in, who doesn't have an agenda, who's not asking you to do what they think you should do, who's not giving you advice, who has the capacity to listen and then ask questions that help you listen to yourself. Because, of course, guess what? If you can use a coach approach, you're in conversation, but when the person is telling you something, you know who else is listening, don't you? Of course, they get to hear what they're saying as well. And that makes a big difference. Now, this is true, obviously, for individuals one-to-one, but it's equally true if I'm doing team coaching inside an organization. And organizations benefit because it becomes a different way of engaging with people. So it starts to permeate the culture. Put it in the context of a family. What would it be like if members of a family could actually listen to each other, ask questions that make it clearer for them what's really going on for someone, what matters to them, what do they want to do now, how are we going to figure these things out together? All of that's going to be what? Clarifying how to proceed. As opposed to, oh, but I thought you meant, and everybody gets upset because they've done their own mind reading of what's going on. So you could say that's the who. Well, what about the how? How did the benefits show up? I think one of the things that's been most striking to me, and this is true across the board, because I've worked with companies in very different market sectors. For instance, internationally, I've done a great deal of work with leaders and managers in the mining sector. The mining sector. Why would you want to do anything to involve a coach approach in the mining sector? Because you need people to act like grown-ups, frankly. They need to take responsibility, because this is where health and safety really kicks in. You get this stuff wrong, you don't have two legs at the end of the day. It's really important that people are functioning adults who hold themselves accountable and take care of others in an appropriate fashion. If you're a team leader, you're not going to mollycoddle people, but you're going to foster them to be alert. And how do you do that? Not by telling them, but by enabling them to take on this mantle themselves and know that they can do it. That's one extreme. I suppose the other extreme would be things like working with financial advisors all over the world who are engaged in handling large amounts of other people's money. And how do they do that in a responsible fashion such that they can become trusted advisors? Now, a trusted advisor is not somebody who's forever doing this, tell. It's actually somebody who does something very different, who asks the client what's important to them and knows how to draw that out of the person, such that very often the client ends up knowing more than they did when they started about themselves. And then they come to trust the advice of that person, not because they're doling out advice so much as what somebody said to me recently. I've got a real challenge coming up, and I just wanted to bounce this around with you. I wanted to hear your take on it. Now, that's an act of trust, and that's going to have a huge impact. So it means that you help people, for instance, become better decision makers because you help them make their own decisions, not because you tell them what they should do. So imagine if you had a team reporting to you. You encourage them to be more proactive, but at the same time, as you empower them, you also help them become more accountable because they hold themselves accountable. It's not that you're some sort of big bad daddy, big bad mummy. No, you're just naturally talking to them collegially. You have different roles, you have different responsibilities, you have different levels of seniority, but you are colleagues and you hold them in high esteem and you respect them. And when people feel respected, they respect themselves and they act differently. All of that, courtesy of the coach approach, personally, I think it's a pretty good deal. So, if I was just thinking about how to sum all of this up. So one way of doing that would be to say, there are these three different dimensions, doing, thinking, and being. So coach approach, I think it offers you a way of coming at life ultimately. And the way you do things is different. Now, part of the doing is you have a skill set that most people don't have. You can learn it really very quickly. So there are tools, there are skills, there are techniques, and they will be incredibly useful. So you can do things differently. That skill set matters. But it's not just a skill set in terms of, oh, I've got a handy technique. There are techniques and you can use them, as I say, in the corridor. Never mind formal meetings. You can use them on the phone. As long as you're engaging with another human being, you can use them. But there's also something about thinking. And what I mean by that is the kind of mindset that comes with a coach approach. And that's one where you are almost taking it for granted that the person you're talking to, for instance, knows far more about their life and themselves than you ever will. Now, why does that matter? Because you're not the expert on them. They are. They may not know they're the expert. They may not be acting in necessarily the best way right now. But is it possible to tap the wisdom that they have within themselves? Of course it is. And is it possible to help them grow themselves? Absolutely. But that's a mindset rather than, this idiot is hopeless and the sooner we can exit them, the better. No. There's so much talent that is not being utilized in teams right now. And part of it is because team leaders don't know how to access it and don't know how to help team members have more of what they've got inside them available to them at work today, tomorrow. So there's something else that matters here, which is not just the way you think, it's the way you are. Because if you're in any kind of leadership role, the way you are is so profound in its impact. Let's take leadership roles across the board. Being a parent, the way you are, do you think that influences how your kids are? Of course it does. Of course it does. I mean, it's scary just how influential it can be. So put it in the world of work context, the way you are, does that influence how other people are? Sure it does. So what are you doing to determine how you come across? What are you doing to ensure that you're at your best? And I think that's part of what we need to focus on. That a coach approach is really useful, but it's not like, I'm going to use the coach approach on you. It's not on anybody. It's like, I'm going to use these tools, this way of thinking and this way of being, because I find it draws out more in people that they already have, which is a win-win for us all. But I have to start with myself. Do I adopt a coach approach for myself in what I'm doing? Do I regularly beat myself up because I didn't do as well as I thought? Or do I begin to ask myself, what is it I could do that would enable me to be more effective? Because as soon as you ask any kind of question like that, you're really asking something of yourself. We spend a lot of our time with our attention going out because we're paying attention to what's out there. Fair enough. But the danger is we don't spend enough time turning that back so that we focus and know what the hell's going on internally. You have good days and bad days. Okay. So suppose you could foster the best in yourself by putting yourself in the right kind of settings, doing the kind of things that you particularly can bring to the party, knowing what those are, a lot of people don't, and being clear about where you want to put your energy and your attention. Again, if you can do that, you're going to be so much more impactful in whatever you're doing with other people, but also for yourself. And the easiest way I know to start doing some of that is to use a coach approach. But it's hard to do it on your own, just with yourself. Sort of DIY coaching it's possible, but it's a bit like DIY brain surgery. Really? It's so much easier to converse, which is why human beings do it. There's a beautiful story of somebody saying, how can I know what I think until I've heard what I say? And that process of articulating clarifies our thinking. So, coach approach. Never mind about being a coach. I had a very interesting experience a few years back. I was working with a colleague of mine, and she's been training coaches for many, many years, as have I. And there was a big conference, the International Coach Federation was doing a big conference in London. And I said to her, I want to put in a proposal. We do something, and I want to call it a somewhat provocative title, that coaching is far too important to be left to coaches. And I thought this might ruffle a few feathers, but I was really encouraged that, in fact, they said, yeah, we really need this. And the people who turned up, the place was packed. The people who turned up were the most senior coaches, the people who've been in the business probably longest of all, because they all knew that there's something beyond being a coach. It's using a coach approach and just taking that into the world wherever you are, whatever you do. That's what I'd like for you. If you're interested, and if you are, we run all sorts of different programs. So feel free, you can do a full-scale training. In-house work is something I've been doing like it feels forever. And it's so fascinating because you can always tailor it to particular needs. And next step, if you want a next step, it's going to probably be, call one of the learning advisors at ITS, because we can actually give you examples of how you might apply it, how you can have employers fund it, and so forth. But for now, I think the essence is really simple, that there's something that is so fundamental to drawing the best out of people, and it's the coach approach. And you can do that, anybody can do it, and whatever your role, you will find uses for it. So absolutely, your call, your future, make the most of it, and that's your choice. And if you choose to engage in one of the many ways we have of making this available, then I look forward to meeting with you, probably in the relatively near future. Till then, bye-bye.